So good evening, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Emerging Futures, What's Next? And in this series, we are talking to entrepreneurs, business owners with experience that is distilled into teachable information that can help the rest of us avoid common pitfalls. Even though their advice should be treated as a source of inspiration, not a prescription, we can avoid a lot of useless theory by listening to those who are doers, not simply dreamers. I enjoy finding these gems of information, and when I do, I bring them here to share them with you on a hangout. We will be talking with world-renowned business leaders doing straightforward, honest advice, giving us straightforward, honest advice on matters that matters to you. So this hangout is more of a conversation. It's not a one-way stream, and it's nothing without your engagement. If you're watching us, if you want to join the hangout, please share your comments, your questions, and we'll share them with our guests. Today, my guest is Benjamin Jealous. Hi, Ben.
Hey.
And Ben is the former president of the NAACP. He is the youngest president of the NAACP. And he stepped down from his post at the end of 2013 and became a venture capitalist at, I'm going to mess it up, Capper Center, is that right?
At K-Port Capital.
K-Port Capital. I knew I'm going to mess it up. K-Port Capital. And you are investing in in companies who are doing social good in the world.
That's right. We're a double bottom line company. We invest in seed stage social impact tech.
And what's really interesting and why I asked you to join this hangout, Ben, is actually, and now I'm going to stop reading and just dive into a conversation with you. And let me So what's really interesting about what you've been doing, that is loud.
Seems like it.
I cannot unmute me, sure. There we go. So what's interesting about what you've been doing, you took an organization, the NAACP. You took an organization that was, a lot of people were saying that is dying. It's, there's not a lot of participation, nothing is happening. A lot of people are not donating to keep it alive. And you came in and you completely changed a lot of things there. You basically brought new life to this movement. And when I first heard you speak at the Success Summit, you were talking about movements and how we are coming together as people. And what's really fascinating to me is that change. What happened, how do you first revive a movement? How do you get people involved when, it seems like our society today is so concentrated on the individual?
So look, I think you kind of start with just sort of the kind of natural order of things. I mean, if something isn't growing, it's dying. There is no static state in this world. And so it is for our country, and so it is for social movements. At the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, we were coming up on the eve of our centennial. And actually a whole team of us had come together to lead the national staff and the national board, who were very much focused on making sure that we were growing to meet the needs of this moment. And what became clear to us was that we had to be sort of more like we were, if you will, at the beginning than we had been in recent decades if we wanted to be as great in the 21st century, as impactful as we were in the 20th. And what that really came down to was getting back to the basics of simply saying what must change, and then saying, well, then that will be our goal. And we will stay focused on winning that victory until it's won. That's one of the things I think people today tend to sort of misunderstand about social movements. Great social movements are decades in the making. They're not 3 to 5 year strategies.
Yeah.
And what inspires people are really big transformative goals. You can see that in some ways with the marriage equality movement right now in this country. I'm sorry, I'm knocking this camera all over the place. You can see this right now with the marriage equality movement, which 10 years ago people laughed at. And there have been people kind of building up to even to that moment, going back to Harvey Milk and things, and LGBT social movements in the 50s and 60s. even just to get to the point where people would laugh at it, right?
Right.
And now Michelle Bachmann says that it's a boring subject, and it's basically a foregone conclusion, right? Crazy, way out there, Bachmann. So that's what folks really have to understand, is that you got to start with a big idea. You have to have a conviction to win. You break that down into achievable steps, and you go after it incessantly. And one of my sort of proudest series of moments at the NAACP was that we abolished the death penalty in 5 states in 5 years, including the first state south of the Mason-Dixon. But when we stood there in Maryland, that first state south of the first southern state to abolish the death penalty, we had to acknowledge that Frederick Douglass had actually started that quest some 150 years earlier, and that we were simply finishing what he had started. And that's what we have to get back to, these big ideas and having the commitment to actually fight for decades if we have to.
So sometimes, Ben, though, big ideas are kind of scaring people, and they're saying, this is never going to happen. It's too big. Nobody's ever going to do that. There's never going to be a black man in the White House. There is never going to be a woman. There is never going to be a Jew, right? So sometimes these ideas are like so big. How do you get people, to show up and actually stand behind something that they don't even believe they might see in their lifetime?
One of the things that we have that many of our ancestors didn't have is reason to have some confidence that a better future is coming, and all we have to do is speed it up. If you were standing there in the midst of slavery, say after slavery had been going on for hundreds of years, it may be hard to actually say a better future is coming, right? You're standing there in the midst of the Holocaust, it's hard to say a better future is coming. But standing here on the other side, being the children and the grandchildren of people and the great-grandchildren who survived slavery, who survived the Holocaust, it should give you a certain amount of confidence to be able to say, we've gone through worse, and we'll see the other side of this. And if you can get people to that point, then it's a much shorter leap for you to say to them, and all we have to do is decide that we want to make that future come even faster.
I love that.
Because they feel like history is already on their side. They can understand that there's a certain flow of things that they're a part of, and therefore, if you will, they have backup in ways that might not even be visible, like almost like karmic backup to some extent.
Yeah.
And it helps them metabolize what others did. Because slavery was going to end at some point. Humanity just couldn't tolerate it forever. But what the organizers that we refer to as the abolitionists did is they made it end faster than it would have by itself.
So this was then, right? And we are talking, it's not that long ago. Was it 60 years, right? It's not that long ago where things started to change. And some might say, in my generation, in my kids' generation, there is no more color. People don't see color anymore. But we know, like we're seeing in the street, and we see that that's not true. So how do we came this far? There are certain rights, like everybody votes, women vote, people can talk, there's a black president, but still there's some kind of a sense of inequality.
Look, we are at a place in our country's history where we really are moving in many ways 2 ways at once. And those of us who are committed to making sure that our country keeps moving in a positive direction have to really choose to get involved. On the one hand, yes, we do have a black president. We have broken a real glass ceiling, I would say, not just for black people or people of color, but for all people, because he became president in a year when most of us were convinced that a woman would be president. Mm-hmm. At the same time, we're seeing massive assaults on our right to vote. And one thing for us to really be cognizant of is that our country is in a demographic pressure cooker at this moment. We've been here before, but for all of us who are living now, this is the first time that we've been there together, if you will. In 2042-43, our country will become a nation only of minorities. Some people have said, oh, it'll be a majority-minority nation. Well, what does that mean? It means there's no more majority.
Right.
Put it more plainly, it is the end of white domination demographically in our country. And what that means is that every group will have to get along with at least one other group demographically in order to succeed democratically. You won't be able to have an election like the one that brought Ronald Reagan into office, where he basically campaigned essentially focusing on white men and kind of white women as an afterthought, and was able to become president. You know, Mitt Romney tried to run that sort of campaign. It failed miserably. As Clarence Page summed it up, you know, his campaign, and I think he was even talking about the McCain campaign as well, could be simply summarized as, honey, we forgot the minorities. and so, you know, and the last time that we found ourselves at a place like this, where the black vote was growing in power, and people of color were migrating to this country in ever-increasing numbers, and a big section of the white electorate felt very anxious about the implications of that, was the period right after the Civil War, when our country passed the Chinese Exclusion Act in response to the 14th Amendment, because the 14th Amendment didn't just say that we're all equal. It also said if you're born here, you're a citizen. And and if you look at the Senate debates, they would start with this fretting over the so-called rising Mongol tide, as they would refer to the ever-increasing numbers of Chinese coming to the U.S. at that time. They would fret about there would be no place for the white man to even own a home in California if they didn't do something about it. And then they would get into the kind of base racism against black folks. I think they probably thought it was a little tacky right after this Civil War to start with the racism against blacks, but they would invariably end up there. Frederick Douglass at that moment, in a speech called Our Composite Nationality, which if you only read one speech by a 19th century orator this year, read that one. Says a couple of really important things. One of them, he says, look, we didn't just, and this is a paraphrase, because you have to paraphrase 19th century orators.
We all
he says, look, we didn't just come through a great war to end slavery in the Southeast to watch you enslave somebody else in the Southwest, talking about the Chinese building railroads across the country. And from that came the mandate that the Black Civil Rights Movement has to this day to always be on the side, if you will, of fair treatment of people of color seeking to come to this country. But then he goes on to say, and this is the part that I think is kind of most universal, important to all of us. He says, every nation has a unique destiny, and that destiny is based on its character, and its character is defined by that nation at its best, not its worst. And that character is shaped by its geography, and our geography is unique. We are connected north and south by borders to two nations of different races, two friendly nations of different races, and east and west we're bordered by oceans that connect us to every other country on the face of the planet. And our destiny, based on our character, defined by us at our best, and shaped by that very unique geography, and this part is a direct quote, is to be the most perfect example of the unity of the human family that the world has ever known. And so that, if you look back at what was happening then with this assault on black voting rights, with this assault on migrants of color coming into this country, and you look at where we are right now, it's very similar. And so the question is, do we get down into sort of the mud and the muck and lower our own best selves fighting over scraps like they did with the Chinese Exclusion Act and like people are doing with HB 56 and SB 1070 and all of that in Arizona, Alabama, and so forth? Or do we actually rise above and seek to be transcendent and say, hey, yes, there actually is this great destiny for our country, and it's hard work, and it requires a lot of faith. But if we accept that challenge, our nation will be better, the world will be better, and our children will have just more. And that's the last thing I would say, is that if you look at the last 40 years, what's clear is that those who had something 40 years ago tend to have more now. Mm-hmm. It's true in the white community, it's true in the black community. The black upper middle class has quadrupled since Dr. King was killed some 46 years ago. But those who didn't have a whole lot back then, their children tend to be doing worse off now. So for instance, the percentage of blacks living in poverty has stayed almost exactly the same from 1968 to today. And if you look at whites living in poverty, there's a similar story. We have to get back to a place where our movements are principally about the people at the very bottom and lifting them up. That we actually get excited, if you will, about raising the floor, even more excited than we do about lifting the ceiling. Because fundamentally, that's what has made our country greatest, are the times that we've decided to lift the floor.
So when we're looking at doing that, exactly that, which I'm also very passionate about this. There's a difference in access, right, to resources, and there's also education, and there's also the lack of like you're saying, just knowledge, just basic knowledge. People are not exposed to iPads, or people are not exposed to programming, or people are not exposed to technology. But on the other hand, I'm looking at Hispanics here in Austin. They might not have a sofa, but they'll have a big screen TV. So there's kind of like this thing of like, okay, what are you investing in? And is that just pop culture? Do we need to change pop culture in order to help people basically rise up?
Well, look, we're a society that's always been founded upon consumerism, and you see it with the very wealthy, and you see it with the very poor. People in this country are, quite frankly, a broad swath of them are likely to live paycheck to paycheck, because it's our habit in this country to just consume and overconsume. At the same time, I think what each of us really should be focused on in our cities and our communities and in our companies is what can we do to actually lift the floor, for our fellow neighbors. Here at Cape Ward Capital and the Cape Ward Center for Social Impact, one of the things that we're most proud of is our support of the Level Playing Field Institute, which takes young people who may be on a track for a community college or for a low-level state school and literally kind of helps them bend their trajectory up towards MIT, Cal, Stanford. We look for students that are in 100% free and reduced lunch schools who are B and C students but still have promise. And we take them for 15 weeks, 5 weeks every summer after freshman year, sophomore year, junior year, and give them intensive training in comp sci, in mathematics, and the full range of STEM fields, biochemistry, and then send them back to their schools more engaged, have it actually, if you will, moved forward in the summer rather than slid back. And you see them just get hungrier and hungrier and more aggressive in their own academics and their own studies. And all of a sudden, this kid who freshman year was kind of a B and C student, senior year is an A student, and they're headed off to a great future. And that's one of the ways that racism really hurts us in this country. The whole legacy of kind of color-based discrimination and discrimination against people who are not from European cultures is that we kind of lull ourselves into actually believing that genius isn't what life actually proves it to be, which is constant across humanity. That however you divide up humanity, by zip code, by color, by country of origin, it's as likely to find a genius in any group of 100 people. The question is, what opportunities does that person have to refine their genius, to put it to use, to put it to the use of our country? And that's one of the things that I think the older I get, the more concerned I get. If you sit in an NAACP meeting or a Tea Party meeting, and I've sat at the front of one and the back of the other, you feel the same sense of angst, that it just doesn't mean what it used to mean to be a citizen of this country. If you were a citizen of this country after World War II, you felt like everything was sort of headed up.
Yeah.
And if you're a citizen of this country, if you will, after this most current war, you feel like everything's sliding down. And the way that we get back headed up again is for us to decide that we have everything that we need right here in this country. that we have all the geniuses, that we have all the wealth, that we have all the possibilities, and what we really most need to focus on is how do we extract, all of the potential from our own young people.
Yeah, and this is actually okay. So this is fascinating. If we are looking at humanity as a whole, right, at all of us, there's no gender, there's no sex, there's no color. It's just humanity as a whole. How do we help all of us? Is there even room for the NAACP, for the Jewish organization, for just women, or is it something that we all going like, okay, we, human of this earth, come together regardless of our origin, our color, our faith, and we are helping everyone, to rise up? Why do we need separate organizations for each group if we're all trying to be, connected?
Look, I think that we need all of those groups for a whole range of reasons. Some of them are social, some of them have to do with just the simple politics of the country and how you combine demands for improvement. And certainly as a response to, to kind of organize people to respond to various forms of discrimination. To be clear, the NAACP from its beginning has never been a black organization. It's always been a very black organization, but not just simply a black organization. And it sought principally to organize people based on their commitment to ending racism. And it has always recognized that that took a broad range of folks to get that done. What I think is most important, and what I've been what makes me optimistic, was that, look, going back to 2011, 12, even 13, and looking forward to next year, when you see state legislatures attack everybody's rights all at once, right? I mean, you just look at the headlines that are coming out in 2011, and first they're trying to require transvaginal ultrasounds, and then the next day they're trying to gut the Clean Air and the Clean Water Act, and then the next day they're trying to gut workers' right to organize, and the next day they want to kill affirmative action, and it just keeps on going. What we've seen is actually progressive organizations say, you know what, there's a temptation here to balkanize. There's a temptation here for each of us just to pull back to our corner and defend what we've already gained. But forget that strategy. We're going to adopt the motto of the Three Musketeers, say all for one for all, and actually find strength in coming together and in recognizing the commonality of our agenda. I mean, you take an issue like voting rights, and the decision of the Sierra Club and Greenpeace, both in the last couple of years, to actually get involved in the fight to secure voting rights. One of the things that they had to recognize was that the Koch brothers were coming after voting rights, in part because, coming after voting rights of Latinos, blacks, and young people of all colors. That's who gets most impacted by something like a voter ID bill, because they had figured out that those groups were the most likely to support environmental protection, and therefore to support regulation that would make it harder for the Koch brothers to make money from coal. And so they kind of reversed engineered the Koch brothers equation and kind of came around to the conclusion, oh, well, if they're trying to assault voting rights to make it easier to thwart our movement, then our movement better seek to protect voting rights to make it easier for us to win. And it's that sort of thinking that, in a state like Maryland, in 2012, we saw in one state, the state abolished the death penalty, passed marriage equality, passed the DREAM Act, expand voting rights, and passed sensible gun safety reform, because they actually were able to sort of take the mindset of the moment that was playing an effective defense in other states and go on the offense in their state. And that's where I want to see all of our states get to, is a place where our movements are working together and where we're comfortable pursuing multiple audacious goals all at once, with the understanding that if we're all working together, then more is actually more for all of us.
Totally agree. I was watching one of the videos about blacks in America and how they are participating in Silicon Valley, which is now the route that you're taking more with the investment. And someone was saying, Silicon Valley, the only color that matters there is green. So if there's not, if there's a black or a Jewish or a woman with a great idea, Silicon Valley doesn't really care who you are. They care, they're going to make money from it or not. So how come there aren't many Black entrepreneurs, women entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley? Is it because really access is limited, or is it because there hasn't been great ideas yet?
I don't think it's for lack of ideas, that's for sure. What is clear here is that social networks matter. And if you look at where the big companies tend to recruit from, there's about 7 schools that rise to the top. People, whether they're male, female, white, or Black, who don't come from those 7 schools, have greater obstacles to overcome, right? And it just sort of goes on and on and on. And what we do see here at Caper Capital is that it is possible to build a portfolio that's very successful, that's at least half Black, Latino, and female-founded companies. Half of our portfolio, and we're very successful at what we do, are have founders of color, Black or Latino, or women. So the ideas are there, but there are real obstacles here. And I think that what you're starting to see is people actually recognize that this place isn't the meritocracy that everybody wants to pretend that it is, and that there's actually opportunities out there that need to be sought out. That there is, if you will, an advantage of taking a strategy like ours and saying, you know what, we're going to open our door a bit wider. We're going to be a little bit more proactive about going out there and looking for ideas, because if you spend enough time here, and I grew up, sort of in the, on the outer perimeter of the valley, and have friends I went to high school with who have been serial entrepreneurs, and folks, if you get to them around the table at dinner, will admit there's actually a series of kind of small cliques, and you're either in the clique or you're out of the clique. And if you're in the clique, it's a lot easier. If you're out of the clique, it's not so. It's not so easy. Some of that's about race. A lot of it is about a lot of other things, like where'd you go to school, or which company did you work for. And so that's what kind of makes me optimistic, is that there are great ideas out there. There's increasingly money that wants to back them. And we're starting to really see people decide that there's money to be made in solving the problems of poor people. You take a company like Pigeonly. Pigeonly is based in Las Vegas. 30-year-old Black founder who was formerly incarcerated, and I think he was actually 28 when he started the company. And they've thoroughly disrupted the prison phone call racket. They're growing by about 20% per month, and really show no signs of stopping. And they've got a very impressive strategy for first making prison less expensive, if you will, being a prisoner less expensive, and ultimately making poverty less expensive by actually marketing to the families of the inmates and ultimately to the broader community that they're a part of. And I think that's sort of the biggest crisis in the Silicon Valley, is that entrepreneurs scratch their own itch. And if you draw almost all your entrepreneurs from a very narrow demographic, then you can ultimately get a very narrow range of itches, and you miss out on a whole bunch of opportunities.
Yes, totally. Love that. There's so many, Ben, so many questions that come to mind just after this answer, but I want to let you guys know, first of all, those who are watching us, thank you. I'll be taking your questions and comment. Joy Grace just shared something really great. I'll share that. But before we dive into more conversation with everyone here, what do we do for the future, right? We're seeing a lot of things that are changing. On one hand, we have to bring up Ferguson and the riots there. On the other hand, we have disturbing economies like Uber and Airbnb that are changing our society and the way we do business, right? Really disturbing big industries. And on the other one is companies like open source, like Asana, and the one you're just sharing now. The internet is opening. They're opening the world, they're removing boundaries, and they're allowing people to really shine with their genius, right, and change the world. You see us today with all the chaos that is happening in the country, and how do we move to a place where, like you're saying in the prayer that we say every day, one nation under one God, how do we get there from here? In 3 minutes, right? No, I'm kidding.
Well, look, I think that actually disruptive technologies have a lot of promise for kind of us creating a more open society and expanding opportunity if they're used in a way, that's if they're used with good intent, right? And that's kind of one of the real challenges, and one of the challenges for us here at Caper Capital. The where I put my hope is ultimately in our country's ability to rise to the great challenges that we decide that we must rise to. There was articles over the weekend about how ISIS supporters couldn't stop tweeting about Ferguson. And it reminded me that in the midst of the Cold War, we decided that segregation was a mistake that we had to rectify, and quickly, because it hurt our ability to actually prosecute and win the Cold War. That it was being used by the Russians and propagandists against us effectively in other parts of the world, that we wanted to have greater influence, and that we weren't going to have that influence until we outlawed segregation. And I think similarly, we have to understand that we have no secrets. What happens here is broadcast around the world, and I believe that we can be as influential in this century as we were in the last. But it starts with us deciding to be as courageous, committing to be as transformative, and ultimately, to recognizing that if you're going to lead a world that is flat and getting flatter by the minute, then we actually have to be getting flatter even faster than the rest of the world. And that's where our commitment to building a brighter pipeline into tech, but ultimately our broader commitment to making sure that our country continues to stay on the course that Dr. King, that JFK, that so many of the builders of our nation during the post-World War II period, even Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the group that he kept coming through World War II, with regards to increasing rights for working people and social security, things like that, that we've got to just simply stay focused on pushing forward, making our country flatter, making it more inclusive, and keeping us ahead of the curve. We're slipping behind the curve of the rest of the world in areas like education, and you simply cannot continue to lead the world in innovation and job creation when you're 20-something in in actually training your K through 12 kids and their achievement. I mean, when the U.S. is behind Singapore in the performance of its grade school children, we all need to worry.
So how many people in government, how many of our leaders feel that same way, and how many of them are really worried about the day where minorities become the majority?
Yeah, I don't think the two things are mutually exclusive. I've sat with some very conservative, somewhat retrogressive politicians who are legitimately concerned about the competitiveness of our country and of their states. And that's where we were able to find commonality on issues like universal pre-K, on issues like shrinking the prison system. And so I think it's important to recognize in politics you don't have to agree with somebody 100% of the time. At any given moment, you just got to be able to find one thing that you can agree on. You move that forward, and you come back and you find something else you can agree on, and you move that forward. And that's why the state of Texas, for instance, is downsizing its prisons faster than the state of California, because even though California has a much more progressive governor, Rick Perry, Texas, has ultimately been willing to sign 50-something bills that the NAACP and the Tea Party found common cause on to shrink that state's prison system. And so I think it's possible at the end of the day to be fighting a governor who, on the one hand, like Rick Perry, is totally in the wrong place as far as the future of our country demographically, whether it's voting rights or whether it's the treatment of people coming across the southern border of this country. But find something else that that we can move forward together, like we did as far as the downsizing of the Texas prison system.
Yes, that's there's now the death penalty. There's a guy there who I can't remember. He murdered his mother-in-law, parents-in-law, and he is about to be executed. So this is
Yeah, no, I mean look, the death penalty. We will only abolish the death penalty in Texas when we're able to abolish it for the country as a whole. We have, I think, about 9 states to go before we'll be able to go to the Supreme Court and ask them to abolish it. But we'll get there. But the important thing, I think, when you're leading a social movement, is to be somewhat opportunistic, to be able to kind of see, oh, there's a crack over there. Let's move through that crack. And whenever you move through one crack, you ultimately create a crack somewhere else. And then you turn around and you look at the wall and you go back through that crack, and eventually the wall crumbles.
So Joy Grace is asking, she says, I'm curious if you know and if you're able to share, what is the NAACP's big goals from 2014 and then looking ahead for 2015, 2016? What is the number one action step that she could do in supporting of that goal, aside from, of course, donating money?
Sure. So look, with any volunteer-based organization, you talk about work, wisdom, and wealth. So giving money is part of what you can do. Giving your time is just as valuable. And depending on where you are in your stage of life, sometimes just being in the room with the other volunteers who may have more energy than you and actually imparting your wisdom can be very helpful too. And I would encourage her and anybody else, whether it's the NAACP or it's a similar, or it's the League of Women Voters, to find the organization that fits you best and to really give your time and to get involved. We say in this country there are only two types of power. There's organized money and there's organized people. Yeah. And when it comes to politics, organized people still have the trump card in a democracy, but you have to be organized. It doesn't hold for just people. You have to be organized. As far as the goals of the NAACP, there's 5 big game changers. They're all there on the NAACP website, naacp.org. And what we decided to do was to go back to actually not asking what needs to happen in 5 years or what needs to happen in 50 years, and then to chart a course towards that. In a number of states, the way that that's going to play out with these very conservative governments that have come into control, most of our states, is going to be focusing on universal pre-K, where it's not in place now, focusing on raising the minimum wage, focusing on shrinking prisons, and focusing on bolstering inclusion programs, affirmative action for small business people, and so forth. In other words, there are things that your agenda. Nelson Mandela once said, the oppressor sets the terms of the struggle. The people who are in control ultimately define sort of the range of issues where you can find relatively easy agreement. And at this moment, universal pre-K, downsizing the prison system, and raising the minimum wage are all areas where we can find broader agreement across party lines.
Love it. Dan, my friend, unmute.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what you've said, and I think it's fascinating. You're a very obviously accomplished young man, and really interesting. And I want to just make two comments. I got 2 quick questions. And ironically, I just saw a breaking news thing on the Sony leak. They leaked the salaries of the executives, and just to be timely here, they said most are white and male at Sony. So that'll be in the news later. On Uber, and I'm a newspaper publisher in Virginia, so I know all about legacy industry. Sir?
Which paper?
Warren and Frederick County Report in northwestern Virginia, where the Skyline Drive begins.
Very good.
So on Uber, I covered the D.C. Council when they were discussing whether to let Uber in. And I remember there was one of the council members represented, I'm thinking southeast, but kind of a rough section of town, and he said he loved Uber because the regular cabs wouldn't come to his home at night, and Uber would. Right. And so we're seeing on a lot of these issues, we see a lot of, for lack of a better term, BS or demagoguery from one side or the other. And Uber, basically the opposition, same thing with all these, is from the legacy incumbents. The cab companies that have spent, in some cases, $1 million for a medallion. All of a sudden, Uber comes in there with no regulation. I can see that side. At the other side of the coin is it's cheaper and the consumers want it. So how they're dealing with this, it's on a case-per-case basis. We'll see. On immigration, I found it very interesting that, and I have a soft spot on immigration because, first of all, we're not going to bust 12 million people out I'm not a Cherokee, you're not a Navajo. I mean, let's not kid ourselves.
Right.
Immigration is what made our country great because we had the best and brightest, most entrepreneurial people from every single country, the cream of the crop that came together. They're not, the Republican tactic on this is not to attack the policies, because most of the planks in the president's executive action are actually popular even among Republicans. So they're not attacking any of the things he's doing. They're saying it's executive overreach, which is ludicrous in my mind, because if you look at every single president did executive orders except for one, who was only in office like 83 days, and some of them have been things like desegregating the military, pardoning everyone who went to Canada, incarcerating Americans of Japanese descent, far more impactful executive orders than anything the president's done, and he's actually done fewer than his several immediate predecessors. I wanted to ask you, you mentioned the Tea Party, and the Tea Party and the Civil Rights Movement do meet on some things. And my first question is Rand Paul. Yeah. He has made a lot of entreaties to the African American community.
Trying.
He's trying. What do you think about that? What do you think about Rand Paul? And what can other Republicans do to avoid sounding like someone who's appealing to people like me?
Yeah, sure. So, well, I find you pretty easy to appeal to, so I don't know if that's a bad thing. But the Rand Paul comes down to this. When I say he's trying, Rand was kind of rough out the gate, right? Like when he went to Howard and said, to a bunch of poli-sci students at Howard, did you know that 100 years ago, basically all blacks were Republicans, right? I think the collective response was sort of like, duh, and so what, right? and so
Abraham Lincoln was
he's
first
gotten,
Republican president.
No, exactly. It's like, and you almost feel like they should have asked him, and do you know why we all left, right? And so with that said, he's gotten a lot more focus in his comments. Ultimately, and I think you're choosing to focus on things like criminal justice reform. I mean, there is a real weakness with the Democratic Party right now, because if you look at young black voters are feeling very raw when it comes to the mistreatment of blacks by the criminal justice system. And that could be Troy Davis, it could be mass incarceration, it could be Mike Brown, et cetera, et cetera. And yet, mainstream Democrats are more likely to be stuck on stupid when it comes to these failed tough on crime policies than many Republican leaders. Because when you look at the issue of mass incarceration, whether you are a libertarian, whether you are a Christian conservative who very likely to be supporting a prison ministry somewhere, or whether you are a fiscal conservative, there are real compelling reasons why you might oppose mass incarceration. And so I think that he has some messages that could get real traction. The problem is for Rand Paul is that he has chosen to be two things at once that are somewhat contradictory. One is a libertarian, the other is sort of a dyed-in-the-wool Southern politician. And you saw those kind of butt heads when he made his famous comments about how he would have supported the Civil Rights Act of 1964 if he had been in office back then. And then he wanted to get very sophisticated as to why, and then he just said, oh, forget it, fine, I would have supported it. And he's ultimately, if he wants to succeed in being a uniter and not a divider, to use George W. Bush's old terms, then he's going to have to decide that he's willing to let go of some of the kind of dog whistle politics that have defined Southern politicians since the rise of Barry Goldwater. And Rand still indulges in just a little bit of that, and he's going to have to feel comfortable kind of pulling away from that. Whether he can do that, whether he can actually sort of captivate the mind of the country while still winning races in Kentucky, well, that just remains to be seen.
I got one other question real quick, and I know there are others, so I'll be brief. On Ferguson, which we've politely danced around till now. So I don't know what it's like to be pulled over for driving while black. Okay, I'm not going to pretend that I can identify with racial discrimination, and I know it exists, and there have been plenty of examples of it this year. We saw in Albuquerque a completely out of control police department. I remember seeing that homeless guy's on the hill. They say put your gun down or whatever it was, and he put it down. Then like 6 cops shot the guy. We saw the young black man in a car in a gas station. He's following instructions to retrieve his driver's license. The guy shoots him like a dozen times. How the guy lived is beyond me, but you know, good for him. And that cop was charged with a felony. In this case, it's almost like a disservice, because I look at this, and again, I'm a white dude, I get that, but it's like I'm looking at a different planet, because the facts of the case, they were, you know, Michael Brown, quote unquote, the gentle giant, and then you see the videotape of him, the strong arm robbery, and then you see the evidence showing that, you know, he was in the vehicle, his DNA is in the vehicle, his DNA was on the gun, that he did retreat about 35, 40 feet because his blood was there, but he was killed 8 to 10 feet away, so he was coming back. 8 or 9 African-American witnesses there corroborated to various degrees the police officer's story. There's zero forensic evidence that he was shot with his hands up. One of the witnesses said that he was face down on the ground, and the cop came up and finished him off. And it was just, this issue has been demagogued, and it's like I'm looking at a different planet, and I think it's a disservice to, like I said, I agree with almost everything you've said here, but I can't, I don't know why not you, but why so many leaders in the black community have picked up on this particular case, which seems at best very thin, and it makes my white friends just like, what in the hell is going on? And I don't understand. I do agree that there is a problem, the over-militarization of the police department, the fact you had the city of 20,000 and 55 cops and only 2 or 3 were black, I applaud the president's moves today to emphasize community policing, better relationships, and cameras, because we know that Rodney King would not have been a news story but for that video. It keeps cops honest, and it keeps the guilty, you know, going to jail. So that's what we want. So I just, it's what do we do? Because this case it's the most demagogue thing I've seen in a long time.
So look, I think the real question is what do we do? I mean, the reality is that yes, you know, black Americans, white Americans tend to see the issue differently, in part because like I don't think any of us can name an unarmed white man who was killed by the cops. And yet all of us, just as you did, can cite multiple examples, unfortunately, of unarmed black.
Well, see, that's the thing I'm talking about, sir. Like when you say unarmed black teen, right, I'm thinking of some little scrawny, defenseless kid. But he was almost 300 pounds. He was the evidence. If the cop story is even largely true, right, and we can differ on that, and we'll never know.
Sure.
But if I reached into a cop's car,
But let's just concede for point. Let's say that Mike Brown was this, you know, not a gentle giant. Let's say that there was only one aspect to his personality, and that was that a very negative personality. Let's say that was true. You're telling me that in our country, where there's like roughly, I don't know, 5 times as many white men as there are black men, that there aren't any 300-pound white bullies walking around?
Sure, there are. Right,
and the question is, name one who's been shot and killed by the cops who didn't have a gun on him. You can't. I can't either. That's why people see it differently, and you just have to understand that there is, you know, I forget what the factor is. I forget whether it's 9 or it's 10 or it's 90, but it's some multiple that you're more likely to be killed by the cops if you're black than if you're white, if you're unarmed in the same situation, if you just look at the raw numbers. And so it's that sensitivity, right? And what comes with that, you know, is, you know, a country in which, you know, when you look at the prosecution of police officers, they're sort of given every advantage, and the whole system feels like it's just very hard to get a conviction of an officer.
I agree, and my last point, because I know others are waiting. My last point is, we agree on the issue. We agree on the larger issue.
Last question. So going forward, what do we need? We need national standards on use of force and use of force training. I realize it's kind of boring, most people's eyes glaze over, but a big part of the problem here is we are like the only Western nation that doesn't have a standard for when our cops should use violence and when they shouldn't. And we don't have a standard for training them. Just consider this last point, and then we'll move on, is in the UK, where most police officers don't carry guns, they have to be trained on when to use force every 6 months. In the U.S., where virtually every officer does carry a gun, the most common training requirement is 1 day at the academy before you start your career, period, full stop, that's it.
And I would just say that a lot of this is you should read everyone should read the president's plan. It's a big thing, but check it out because a lot of that's addressed in this. He's encouraging that came out today.
Yeah.
I'll post it later, but it's a PDF, and it deals with some of this stuff.
Right, and so that's where we need Boehner and Congress to stand up. I mean, the real frustrating thing, right, is when we were kids, we learned about that Congress, I think it was 1947 to 49, called the so-called Do-Nothing Congress, that passed less than 1,000 bills, so we called them a Do-Nothing Congress. Well, the last Congress passed 220-something bills. They took do-nothingism to a whole new level we've never seen before. 10% of those bills were for commemorative coins. And so the president's plan is, I'm sure is a good plan. The question is, will Congress actually step up and create the laws that we need created so the president can sign?
I think it's executive action, actually. I don't think it's.
Right. Yeah, and that's the problem. Is that true national force standards? In order to be binding on the states, would have to go through the Congress, and that's. We need Boehner, in other words, to have a plan as worthy as the president.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Da. Thanks, Ben. This is so fascinating because it's really is. It's the blood in our veins of this country. Michelle has a really great question about the future of what's happening. Michelle.
Hi, Ben. So I'm here with my 16-year-old. Are you still not? Hi. And it's funny because I'm watching the chat. And it says Chase Patterson, so that would be my 15-year-old son who's logged in as me. So you have just such an amazing background. And what would you tell our youth?
Well, I wanted to talk to you first and foremost because I just read a study that really scared me. I read a study that said, I believe in 2025, about 50% of current occupations will be eliminated.
Right.
And they're going to find robots to do these things. They're going to find other ways that are more efficient than paying somebody minimum wage to do certain jobs. And so, as a person who just graduated high school last week,
she's a quick study, so a couple of years early.
Well, congratulations, and it sounds like you'll have one step on those robots. But yeah, go on.
Exactly. And so, as somebody who's looking at different colleges and looking at the best way to spend my time and money,
or her parents,
I wanted to know what your feedback was and on what a young person should do and what a young person should focus their energy on, knowing that so much of the world is changing and will change as I get older in terms of your path.
Yeah, so look, there's some great books out there. It sounds like you got some time on your hand. There's one called The Second Machine Age. If you just Google that, you'll see several other books. They're worth reading and thinking about. I mean, one of the things that's happening is that when you look at what's happening with robots, with artificial intelligence, the advances are coming very quickly. If you ask yourself what's the most logical application of, say, the Google car in the next 10 years, it would be to actually wipe out a bunch of jobs currently held by the Teamsters and actually going to robotic long-distance trucking. But at the same time, don't sleep on the white-collar jobs. What they're saying is actually entire classes of jobs that are currently held by sort of first-year and second-year investment associates and first years and second years right out of law school and big law firms will be wiped out. That the sort of reports that you're expected to generate as a new lawyer or a new investment associate will be done by computer programs, and in fact are already starting to be done. And so as you chart your career, yes, definitely kind of know where the trends are, what jobs are likely to be replaced and when and which ones aren't. But most importantly, sort of instilling yourself an expectation that you're going to have sort of multiple careers, that there will be periods in your life when you train and when you execute and when you retrain and you try something new. And, I'm going through something right now. I mean, it's a little different. I wasn't replaced by a robot, but I started out working in the mailroom of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund when I was 18. And by the time I was 40, my career in civil rights had kind of run its course. There was no place to go in civil rights after being president of the NAACP. And so now at 41, I've just become an investor. I'm learning an entirely new career. For me, was my way, if you will, to stay in the same groove. My life has always been about trying to find relatively simple solutions for relatively large-scale social problems. This, investing in social impact companies, is just a new way for me to do that. And so that's what I try to say to young people is ultimately give your life a mission and be willing, again, to be a little bit like water in how you pursue that mission, and expect that, yes, that as technology changes, you will need to train and retrain.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for bringing it up. I'm really impressed that you actually figured that out, because there's not enough young people talking about what's about to happen because of robots.
Well, it's scary because a lot of my friends who've just graduated from UC Davis, UCLA, Berkeley, they're working at Starbucks. They're making lattes right now, and they just spent, or their parents just spent $200,000 on their education. Yeah. And so I want to be able to become comfortable with the constant changing in the career force, but at the same time, I also don't want to, become too comfortable with working a, $10 an hour job, right?
No, that's exactly right. And as the parent of young children, I think the most important thing to really instill in children is grit and character and perseverance. Because there is nothing that's going to be easy about success going forward.
Well, and nobody would appreciate it if it was, right?
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. Thank you.
Thank you.
So excited you joined us, and wow, you jumped in, and teenager, I love it.
She pushed her mom over.
Mia, my friend. You're muted. Hold on a second. Hold on, Mia. Okay, go for it.
I just have to give Dan a hard time for bogarting the mic for so long. And I'm now going to call you Encyclopedia Jealous. I could pretty much listen to you all day, seriously. So I appreciate it. So I'm just going to throw out a couple of facts I was reading. So when you were with the NAACP, you tripled online activism, and your donors increased from $16,000 to $132,000. I want to know how you did it, and give us some tips, because I'm sure we can use that not just for obviously for the organization you're with, but just across the board. So help me out with that.
Yeah, so in that period, we actually went from 16,000 people to 132,000 people giving gifts.
Yeah, the number of donors, not the money, but the number of, that's a huge number.
Yeah, and from $23 million to $46 million.
Yes.
And the most important thing in sort of building a movement organization is to make people feel like they're winning. And so we were very kind of ruthless about figuring out, okay, what is it? Where do we want to be in 5 years and 10 years and 50 years? But what can we win right now? And so people can actually see those victories and feel like they're making progress. When we listen to our own members, their greatest sense of feeling dispirited was feeling like we're not winning anymore, we're not transforming anymore. And so, that's what we saw. Ultimately, our online activists went from under 200,000 to over 2 million. And the last million came in the last 6 months I was there. And what happened there was we actually, it was all basically related to Trayvon and the aftermath. And that was really about working class black folks feeling like we were fighting for them again. And so when the ruling came down around George Zimmerman, and it came down on a Saturday night at like 11 p.m., which is the worst time to bring down a controversial ruling, because most young people, if they're out in the street, are kind of drunk at that hour, right? Think about it. Everybody's at the bar, and they come down with this ruling. We went out with a very angry email that ultimately pointed people towards where our system could continue to work and seek justice, which was about the federal government bringing charges. We were then attacked by right-wing hackers who shut down our servers for almost 24 hours. And so we pushed out the same message on text. We saw our text list in 6 days go from 30,000 people to 432,000, which meant that people were forwarding that text to millions of people because only a percentage respond. It's really important at the end of the day that we remember that our movements are primarily about people who have been marginalized, and that we give them a sense of power. And part of that is about, yes, actually saying we're going to win this, and then winning and saying, look, we won it, now we're going to win that, and then winning that. But part of that also is about opening up your own humanity to just be legitimately outraged when outrageous things happen.
Yeah. There's a... It's so interesting because, you know, there's a lot of stuff, and I'll talk from my own experience. I'm being an Israeli online and fighting with the propaganda that comes up sometimes. So, you know, from pro-Palestinian Judaism or something like that. You know, like sometimes you can't have just a regular conversation with people who know the fact without the propaganda. And many times I sit down and I wonder, should I even address this topic? Should I even share? You know, should I stand up for it and just like, go Israel? Or should I be like, you know, my business, my life, my stuff? And getting outrageous in public and really standing up for what you believe in or where you came from or for other people is such a, you know, it's a big step sometimes, especially when you're thinking that everything is public, everything is on the internet forever. And it might hurt you, you know, in one way or another. So this is something very big that you're kind of asking, not just you specifically, but like in general, if we want to change our life together, it's a huge thing to ask people to do is stand up for what you believe in, right?
No, that's exactly right. And the former Governor Cuomo, not Andrew Cuomo, who's currently mayor of New York, but his father, Mario Cuomo, was anti-death penalty in a state that at the time 75% of the people said that they supported the death penalty. And so it was very controversial because a member of the force, one of the NYPD, would get killed. They would expect the governor to be willing to execute the person. He would refuse. And a reporter said to him, you know, how is it that you can have been made governor of the state 3 times while opposing an issue as controversial as the death penalty when 3/4 of your own citizens support it? And he said, you know, people don't decide not to vote for you. They don't decide not to support you because they see you out there with a different position than them on a very controversial issue. So no, people decide not to support you because they see you sticking your finger in the wind and blowing with it. And they decide that you have no backbone. And because if they see you support something controversial, knowing that you disagree with them, then they think, oh, he has a backbone. So whatever he supports me, so whatever we do agree on, he will stick up for that too. But if they see you blowing in the wind, then they say, I can't trust you, even on where we do agree. So I simply won't support you. And I think that's important. You know, yes, it's true. Whatever we say, like this talk, will be on the internet forever. But if people understand, at the end of the day, you've sought to live your life with courage, with conviction, and to actually stand up for the things that you believe in, their only real question will be, at the end of the day, do I agree with this person more often than I don't? Because if I do, then it's in my interest to stand with them because they're not afraid to fight for what they actually believe in. And in these days, in our country, unfortunately, too many of our leaders, it seems, just forgot what courage was.
And talking about courage, Ben, I mean, you had real death threats against you.
Sure.
You know, when you were younger as a journalist, like serious death threats before things have changed and became a little easier, right? This is real courage. Where do you find that? Where, you know, you're waking up and you're like, I don't know who's gonna come behind me and kill me. Do I still go and fight for it? Do I still speak up, or do I just go like, okay, you know, I'm better alive than dead, so might as well go do something else.
Well, you know, I was raised in a tradition of civil and human rights activists in this country, who instill in their children at a very young age that life simply isn't worth living if you don't know what you're living for, if you don't know ultimately what you would die for. And and that helped. But for each of us, at some point, you actually have to decide to internalize what is otherwise just sort of very beautiful kind of rhetoric, but very hard to live. And I remember when I was a young reporter in Mississippi, based in Jackson, but covering the entire state, I was actually investigating, my beat was official corruption, and I was investigating a sheriff up in the northeastern corner of the state, which is one of the most violent parts of Mississippi, and it's the whitest corner of the state. So, if you will, the riskiest for a black journalist to be investigating. And I was working at a paper that had been burned down, mind you, 3 times, and where the last reporter to have my beat was at a mental hospital because she had been gang raped by the officers that she was investigating. So the stakes were clear and they were high. And I started getting very serious death threats. I was trying to prove that a sheriff was complicit in framing a black small farmer for an arson that he did not commit. And I went to my publisher and I said, you know, I'm feeling a little queasy about driving back up to Starksville. The death threats are getting very specific, and you know that's a pretty violent corner of the state. And I said, you know, what should I do? And my publisher, a man named Charles Tisdale, is now deceased, but was a great writer, a great reporter, said, son, do you feel like you're doing what you're supposed to be doing? You feel like you're doing what God's called you to do? And I said, sir, honestly, talking about God's calling is kind of deep right now. And he said, well, let me rephrase that. He said, just tell me, do you feel like you're doing what you're supposed to be doing? And I said, yes, sir. He said, well, that feeling comes from somewhere, son. He said, so my question to you is, who do you fear more? Do you fear, you know, them fools or God himself? And that just kind of made it clear for me. And I understood how it was that this man could rebuild his paper after every time that they burned it down, if they riddled it with machine guns, could hire another reporter, even knowing that the last one, you know, had been so horribly abused, could take risks, could drive a Ford Pinto, knowing that he was getting death threats all the time and be pushed off the road by almost any other vehicle. And I got right back in my car and I went up there, and ultimately, our reporting was credited with helping the defense save this farmer from prison. It was his 3rd trial on the same set of charges. Everything suggested he was going to be facing 20-plus years for a crime he didn't commit. We got the investigation done. He was acquitted in 45 minutes by an all-white jury, and has been free ever since.
Wow. It's just amazing, Ben. And you know, looking at your history and what you've accomplished and what you're doing, now you're moving to Silicon Valley and venture capitalist, and it's really giving me hope that, you know, this might change. So there's a comment from Alan, and it kind of leads to the end of this. He's saying, I heard a comment that there are many new jobs descriptions that did not exist 5 years ago. I really think entrepreneurs and innovators are a job class that's on the rise because classic jobs disappearing. There will always be a need of people for that. There will always be needs of people that want to be served. And so as we finish this, you know, you're moving to really change and close the educational gap and the technological gap. How can people get in touch with you? What is it that, you know, you're looking for, and how can we help you? Or help us in the closing the gap?
Well, look, you know, folks can go to our website. It's kaporcapital.com, K-A-P-O-R, capital.com, and see what we do and what we invest in and how to reach us. And if they have an idea that, you know, a deck that they think we should see, you know, we take pitches all the time. And I'm especially interested in companies that are focused on solving problems for poor people in our society, and increasingly it seems to be either technology that's focused on prisoner reentry or on financial services for the poor and the unbanked. But there's a wide range. We work on ed tech and health tech and a wide range of issues. They can also email me at benjealous@kaporcapital.com, benjealous@kaporcapital.com. But you know, I also think that he's absolutely right. There is a a reality that young people who are trained for a particular job but also trained to be entrepreneurs have a better chance of succeeding. Because what is likely is that you will have a career that starts with you going to school, getting a job in a company, and then something will happen that will just make you decide, I'll be better off if I'm my own boss. And that's why we at Caper Capital and the Caper Center for Social Impact and the Level Playing Field Institute and all of our programs that are focused on young people that we support, at the end of the day, we don't just train people for jobs. We train them to be entrepreneurs. We encourage them to be entrepreneurs because, yes, we can make the front door going into these tech companies much wider, and many of us out here are focused on that, but there always will be also a very wide back door. And we want those young people, if they decide to go out the back door, have them come in the front door, to then innovate and create and scratch their own itch and solve problems for communities that right now are grossly underserved and markets that are grossly undertapped.
Yes, and you know, they've been saying in 2040 or 2042, when that gap disappears, when the majority is really Latino minorities, there's going to be so many more services, so many more jobs, and so many more products that are serving that specific community that don't exist yet. So there's huge.
Yes, the majority will be Latino in Texas, where you are, but in the rest of the country,
I speak Spanish.
Majority people of color. Yeah, absolutely.
Right, I speak Spanish. Yeah, they were saying that the joke was that, you know, they Mexico wanted to take back Texas, but instead of fighting for it, they just come here and, you know, multiply.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Texas, California, it all used to be Mexico. We need to keep that in mind when we talk about folks.
Yeah, and Indian. So thank you so much, Ben. This was great. I know you've had such long days and you still showed up. So thank you so very much. And guys, if you need any investment or anything like that, there are people who are listening to you. So go and check out Ben. And thank you so much. And thank you so much for everybody who joined us. We'll see you again in another episode in a few weeks.